At 3 minutes past 1 in the morning, the emergency operator answered a call that lasted 12 seconds. There was no screaming, no background chaos, no sound of struggle, only breathing. Slow, controlled, intentional. Then a man's voice, calm, almost reflective, whispered a single word: basement. The line disconnected. If you believe that silence always means safety, reconsider that assumption now. Because sometimes the most deliberate voice in the room belongs to the person who already knows how the night will end. Detective Rachel Monroe did not hear the recording until 4 hours later. By then, the patrol officers had already secured the residence. Paramedics had already confirmed what everyone feared. And the house on Linden Grove had already begun its quiet transformation from family home to crime scene. If you pay attention to cases like this, you know the pattern. A cryptic call, an unfinished sentence, a single location reference. But what makes this one different is not the whisper. It is what investigators found in the basement, and what they did not. The residence belonged to Thomas Hale, 42 years old, accountant, married, father of one. No prior criminal record. No domestic disturbance reports. No financial red flags in preliminary checks. His neighbors described him as structured, predictable, the kind of man who cut his grass on the same day every week. He was found seated upright in a wooden chair in his basement workshop. No visible defensive wounds. No immediate signs of forced entry. A single overhead bulb illuminated the room, and on the concrete floor, drawn in chalk, was a circle measuring roughly 6 feet across. Thomas Hale sat precisely at its center. Rachel Monroe entered the house at 7:15 in the morning. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows, cutting sharp angles across polished tile. The domestic stillness felt rehearsed. Coffee mug in the sink, mail stacked neatly by the refrigerator, child's backpack resting near the hallway bench. Nothing overturned, nothing ransacked. The basement door stood open. She paused before descending. Investigators often describe a sensation before entering primary scenes. Not fear, not anticipation, something closer to recalibration, the mind adjusting its expectations downward. The stairs creaked beneath her boots. At the bottom, she saw the chair first, then the circle, then Thomas Hale. His head tilted slightly forward. His hands rested on his thighs. A thin line marked the skin around his wrists, not deep enough to indicate prolonged binding, but noticeable. No rope present. No tape. The coroner estimated time of death between midnight and 1 in the morning, because undetermined at the scene. Rachel crouched near the chalk line. It was clean, unsmudged, deliberate. No footprints crossing it. No drag marks, which suggested one of two possibilities. Either Hale entered the circle willingly and remained there, or someone ensured he did not leave. The whisper, basement, echoed differently now. Upstairs, his wife, Marianne Hale, sat wrapped in a gray blanket on the living room sofa. Her eyes were swollen but dry. Shock often preserves composure in the early hours. She reported that Thomas had gone downstairs shortly before midnight. He told her he needed to check something. She assumed it related to a minor plumbing issue he had mentioned earlier in the evening. She fell asleep. She woke to police knocking on the front door. She claimed she never heard the call. Phone records confirmed the 911 call originated from Thomas Hale's personal cell phone. The device was found on a workbench approximately 8 feet from the chalk circle. Unlocked. No additional outgoing messages. No recent internet searches of concern. Rachel listened to the recording again in her vehicle. Breathing. Controlled. Then, basement. No tremor. No panic. If a man anticipates violence, his voice typically betrays it. Micro instabilities in tone. Subtle acceleration. Irregular inhalation patterns. Thomas Hale sounded composed, which raised a more unsettling question. Was he asking for help or announcing location? Forensic technicians began collecting samples from the chalk residue. Preliminary assessment indicated standard white classroom chalk. No unusual compounds. The circle itself showed no embedded markings. No symbols. No writing. No additional geometry. Just a circle, perfectly centered in the room. Rachel surveyed the basement walls. Shelving units held labeled storage bins. Tools arranged by size. A pegboard organized with mathematical precision. Control. The entire room radiated control, yet in the center of it sat a man who appeared to have surrendered all of it. A faint indentation marked the concrete beneath the chair legs. He had been seated for some time. There were no signs of struggle in the surrounding area. No broken fingernails. No bruising on forearms. And yet the faint wrist impressions persisted. Autopsy would determine whether those impressions resulted from temporary restraint or self-inflicted pressure. Upstairs, detectives interviewed the couple's daughter, 8 years old. She reported hearing one loud thump during the night, but assumed it was her father moving furniture. No screaming, no argument, no disturbance. Rachel requested financial records beyond surface-level checks. Subtle patterns often hide in routine transactions. Within 2 hours, analysts identified 3 cash withdrawals over the past month, each modest, each spaced roughly 10 days apart. Not unusual in isolation, but Thomas Hale historically used electronic payments for nearly everything. Cash introduces opacity. Opacity introduces motive, yet motive without visible conflict is theory, not evidence. By mid-morning, neighbors gathered beyond the police tape. Speculation spread quickly. Ritual rumors, cult theories, domestic dispute whispers. Rachel ignored all of it. She returned to the basement. This time, she stood inside the chalk circle. There was no residue disturbance when she stepped over it. The line remained intact except where technicians had carefully sampled sections. She examined the overhead bulb. Standard fixture. No hidden devices. She crouched again and studied the floor more closely. A nearly invisible scuff mark extended from the edge of the circle toward the workbench. It was faint, almost dismissed as routine wear, but its directionality suggested movement outward. From inside the circle, toward the phone. If Thomas Hale placed the call himself, he would have needed to leave the circle, unless the phone had been inside the circle at some point and later relocated, which meant someone could have repositioned it. But repositioning requires crossing the chalk boundary, and there were no visible disruptions. Rachel replayed the whisper in her mind. The tone carried no urgency, only certainty. Certainty can stem from resignation or compliance. By noon, the medical examiner provided preliminary findings: no external trauma sufficient to cause death. Toxicology pending. No immediate evidence of cardiac anomaly, which left the working classification as suspicious. Rachel asked a simple question during the briefing. Who benefits from a scene that looks staged but contains no spectacle? Silence followed. Because spectacle draws attention. Minimalism invites misdirection. The chalk circle could be symbolic, or it could be a distraction. What if the circle was never meant to imply ritual? What if it was meant to imply consent? If Thomas Hale walked into that circle willingly, sat down, and waited, then the whisper was not fear, it was confirmation. The next discovery arrived shortly after 1 in the afternoon. Digital forensics recovered a deleted audio file recorded at 11:58 p.m., 5 minutes before the emergency call. The file lasted 30 seconds. It contained no speech, only the same measured breathing heard on the call. And at the very end, barely audible, a second set of footsteps on concrete. Not hurried, not aggressive. Gretchen, sopping. No struggle followed, no raised voices. Just silence. Rachel leaned back in her chair as the audio ended. 2 people were present in that basement before Thomas Hale died. One of them spoke. The other did not. And the only word anyone heard was basement. What Thomas Hale did not say may matter more than what he did. Because silence, when chosen carefully, can be an agreement. And someone in that house understood exactly where to stand. If you follow evidence over assumptions, subscribe now. And tell me in the comments, based on what you've heard so far, does the timeline feel intentional or accidental? The first assumption in any contained scene investigation is proximity. Who had access? Who had time? Who understood the space well enough to manipulate it without leaving disruption? By mid-afternoon, the Hale residence felt less like a family home and more like a controlled environment study. Every object remained in its assigned position. Every surface bore the imprint of routine. Detective Rachel Monroe requested a full timeline reconstruction beginning at 6 in the evening the prior night. Marianne Hale stated that dinner occurred at approximately 6:30. Thomas appeared distracted but not agitated. He checked his phone twice during the meal. No visible argument followed. Their daughter left the table early to complete homework upstairs. At 8:15, Thomas reportedly went into the garage for approximately 20 minutes. He told his wife he was organizing tools. No corroboration beyond her statement. At 9:40, they watched television together. A crime documentary, according to Marianne. Thomas commented briefly on investigative errors depicted in the show. He then excused himself to review work emails in the home office. Phone metadata confirmed email access at 9:52. At 11:47, his phone connected to the basement Wi-Fi extender. At 11:58, the deleted audio recording began. At 12:03, the emergency call was placed. At 12:04, the call ended. Estimated time of death between 12 and 1. Rachel replayed the second set of footsteps through enhanced audio filters. The gait suggested measured pace, roughly 6 steps before stopping. Weight distribution appeared balanced. No limp, no dragging. The steps originated from behind the recording device, which indicated Thomas positioned the phone facing outward from within the basement. The audio carried faint room echo consistent with central positioning, inside the circle. If he recorded those footsteps intentionally, then he anticipated their arrival. And if he anticipated arrival, then he knew who was coming. Rachel requested Schupern analysis of every occupant and regular visitor to the home within the last month. While the chalk circle displayed no obvious disruption, the surrounding concrete floor retained microscopic particulate transfer patterns. Forensic mapping would take time. Meanwhile, she re-entered the basement with a laser measurement device. The circle's diameter 6 feet and 2 inches. Chair placement precisely centered. Distance from chair to workbench, 7 feet and 9 inches. Distance from chair to staircase, 11 feet. If someone approached from the stairs, they would have crossed directly through the circle's perimeter unless they entered from the far side and walked behind Thomas, which aligned with the audio orientation. Rachel examined the stair treads. No foreign fibers. No unusual debris. The handrail showed standard household wear. No defensive grip markings, which reinforced a developing hypothesis. There was no struggle because there was no perceived threat. Upstairs, digital analysts completed review of Thomas Hale's financial history beyond surface withdrawals. The 3 cash withdrawals totaled a modest amount, but coincided with an anomaly. Each withdrawal occurred one day after a late-night phone call from a number registered under a prepaid cellular account. Prepaid numbers introduced deliberate anonymity. Call durations ranged between 3 and 8 minutes. Content unknown. Rachel ordered tower triangulation for those calls. Geographic clustering revealed something unexpected. Each originated within a 2-mile radius of the Hale residence. Not a distant operator, not a traveling contact. Someone local, someone close. Marianne Hale consented to voluntary device extraction. Her phone displayed no contact with the prepaid number, no hidden messaging applications, no encrypted platforms. Their daughter's tablet showed typical age-appropriate usage, which left Thomas. His device showed no direct callback to the prepaid number after the last withdrawal. However, one unsaved contact entry existed under the name L. No last name, no address. Only one outgoing call logged to that contact 2 nights prior to his death. Duration 1 minute and 12 seconds. Cellular ping location for that contact less than half a mile from the Hale home. Rachel canvassed the immediate neighborhood personally rather than delegating uniformed officers. Close-range contacts often yield subtle behavioral cues that standard interviews miss. At number 14 Linden Grove, a retired teacher reported seeing Thomas walking alone 3 evenings earlier. At number 16, a couple mentioned nothing unusual. At number 18, directly across from the Hales, resided a man named Leonard Keene. 46, divorced. Freelance contractor. No criminal record. Rachel observed Keene before knocking. He stood at his kitchen window, watching the Hale house through partially parted blinds. When he answered the door, his posture was controlled but guarded. He stated he knew Thomas casually. Occasional driveway conversations. No close friendship. When asked whether he recognized the prepaid number, he denied knowledge. His phone consent search revealed no immediate link, but absence of stored data does not eliminate erased data. Rachel noted something subtle in Keene's driveway. Fresh chalk residue near the curb. Children often use chalk outdoors, except Keene had no children. When asked about it, he stated he occasionally marked measurements during small repair projects, which was plausible. But coincidence, when layered repeatedly, shifts toward pattern. Rachel returned to the station as forensic footwear comparison began. Preliminary results indicated faint particulate within the basement matching fine gravel composition found commonly in the subdivision's driveway aggregate. Not unique, not singular, but consistent. The toxicology update arrived shortly before 6 in the evening. Trace presence of a sedative compound in Thomas Hale's bloodstream. Low dose. Not sufficient alone to cause death, but enough to reduce resistance. No prescription history for that compound, which meant it was introduced externally. Voluntary ingestion remains possible. So does covered administration. Rachel reviewed Marianne Hale's account of dinner preparation. She cooked. He ate. No shared beverages beyond bottled water. The water bottle recovered from the kitchen showed no contamination, which narrowed the window of administration between dinner and midnight. Inside the house, Rachel considered the structure of the scene again. A chalk circle, a seated man, a sedative present, a whisper that sounded intentional. What if the circle was not meant to confine him? What if it was meant to reassure him? Symbols create psychological boundaries. People comply more easily when they believe they are participating in a controlled ritual rather than an uncontrolled event. If Thomas believed he was engaging in something structured, measured, safe, then he would sit calmly. He would breathe steadily. He would record footsteps without panic, and he would whisper, basement, not as a plea but as a confirmation. The question shifted, not who convinced him, and why. By 7 in the evening, enhanced audio from the deleted recording isolated an additional faint sound before the second set of footsteps. A soft metallic click, subtle, rhythmic. Rachel replayed it repeatedly. It resembled the sound of a lighter wheel, or the release of a small mechanical device. It did not resemble a firearm discharge. It did not resemble restraints. It resembled preparation. Thomas Hale may have entered that circle willingly, but someone else entered knowing exactly how it would end. And if the whisper was confirmation, then the call was not a cry for rescue. It was a breadcrumb, deliberately placed, for someone who would understand where to look. Rachel leaned back in her chair as the evening deepened. The basement was not just a location. It was a message, and messages are rarely meant for strangers. By the time the third day began, the case had shifted from shock to calculation. Detective Rachel Monroe no longer viewed the chalk circle as a symbol of spectacle. It was geometry, intentional geometry, and geometry suggests planning. The autopsy report arrived at 8:20 in the morning. Cause of death: acute respiratory suppression consistent with a compounded sedative mixture delivered in higher concentration than initial field testing indicated. The bloodstream levels revealed something important. The first trace sedative detected earlier was only part of the equation. A second compound, fast, acting, metabolized quickly, had been introduced later, which explained the calm breathing on the recording. The first compound lowered resistance. The second ended function. There were no injection marks, no punctures, which narrowed delivery methods significantly. Oral administration, inhalation, or sublingual absorption. Rachel requested full laboratory analysis of basement air particulates. If inhalation occurred, trace aerosolization might remain embedded in the HVAC filter system. The basement ventilation vent sat directly above the chalk circle. Centered, she returned to the Hale residence and stood again inside the circle, directly beneath the vent. Measured distance from vent to chair seat 5 feet. Perfect vertical alignment. If a concentrated vapor were released through that vent while Thomas sat below, exposure would be localized. Minimal dispersal elsewhere in the room. Minimal cross-contamination, which explained the absence of heavy residue on surfaces. The metallic click in the audio returned to her thoughts. Not a lighter. Not a weapon. Possibly a canister trigger, or a timed dispersal mechanism engaging. HVAC technicians dismantled the vent cover. Inside the duct, they found a small adhesive residue mark along the interior wall. Circular, approximately 2 inches in diameter, as though a device had been temporarily affixed and later removed. No device present now. Rachel's jaw tightened slightly. Removal required access after death, which meant someone returned to the basement after Thomas lost consciousness. That someone did not disturb the circle, did not alter the chair, did not erase the faint wrist impressions. They removed only the mechanism. Precision. Calculated risk mitigation. Upstairs, Marianne Hale remained under voluntary observation. Her demeanor had shifted from shock to guarded composure. Rachel conducted a second interview. This time, the questions were narrower. Did your husband mention anyone named Leonard? Marianne hesitated before answering. She acknowledged that Thomas had spoken about a neighbor who gave strange advice. Advice about what? Boundaries? She said. The word lingered. Marianne explained that Thomas had become interested in stress reduction techniques recently. Visualization exercises. Psychological compartmentalization. Ritualized routines meant to contain anxiety. The chalk circle. Rachel asked when this interest began. Approximately 6 weeks earlier, which aligned with the timing of the prepaid phone calls. Rachel asked if Thomas ever practiced these exercises in the basement. Marianne said yes. He would sit in a specific area and claim it helped him focus. Did she ever see a circle drawn? No, she replied. But he mentioned imagining one. Imagining. Which means someone else may have made it real. Rachel returned to Leonard Keene's residence with a warrant for electronic recovery. This time, the search went deeper. Deleted message fragments were reconstructed from temporary storage sectors. One fragment, partially corrupted, displayed a sentence. You must remain inside until it completes. No sender name attached. Timestamp 3 days before Thomas Hale's death. Another fragment referenced. Measured dosage. Keene denied involvement. He claimed the messages were philosophical discussions about meditation boundaries. But meditation rarely involves dosage. A search of his garage revealed something more tangible. A small portable aerosol dispersal device used typically for pesticide applications. Recently cleaned, but not thoroughly enough. Trace chemical analysis revealed residue consistent with one of the sedative compounds found in Thomas Hale's bloodstream. Rachel did not react outwardly. Evidence rarely speaks loudly. It accumulates quietly. Leonard Keene was brought in for formal questioning. He maintained that Thomas had approached him seeking assistance with anxiety rituals. He claimed Thomas wanted to experience controlled surrender as a psychological reset. Controlled surrender. Rachel requested clarification. Keene explained that Thomas believed confronting mortality in a simulated, structured environment could eliminate his fear of unpredictability. Keene described the chalk circle as a symbolic boundary, a safe perimeter within which Thomas would relinquish control temporarily. And the sedatives? Rachel asked. Keene said Thomas requested something mild to deepen relaxation. He admitted to providing an initial compound in small doses over prior weeks. He denied administering a lethal amount. He denied returning to the basement after Thomas lost consciousness. He denied removing any device. Rachel let silence stretch. In silence, people often correct themselves. Keene shifted slightly in his seat. Then he added something unprompted. He insisted on recording it. Rachel asked what he meant. Keene said Thomas wanted documentation of the process. Proof he could remain calm. Which aligned with the deleted breathing file. And the 911 call? She asked. Keene claimed no knowledge. He said Thomas mentioned wanting an emergency anchor. Something that symbolized safety nearby. A symbolic lifeline. Rachel reviewed the call timestamp again. 12:03. If Thomas lost consciousness shortly thereafter, the call preceded full respiratory suppression, which means he was still capable of speech. Which means the whisper was intentional. Rachel shifted the conversation. Did you remove a device from his vent? Keene's pupils constricted slightly before he answered. No. Micro-expression analysis suggested deception. But deception alone is not proof. Forensic lab results from the HVAC filter arrived at 4 in the afternoon. Concentrated sedative particulate found embedded in the filter fibers. Distribution pattern indicated release from a point source within the vent, not from floor level. Localized dispersal consistent with timed aerosol emission, which meant someone installed a device. Someone activated it. Someone removed it. The chalk circle was not containment. It was positioning. Thomas Hale did not simply sit and breathe. He sat directly beneath a delivery system, and someone ensured he remained there. The faint wrist impressions returned to relevance. Not deep enough for prolonged restraint, but sufficient to indicate temporary securing, perhaps long enough to ensure exposure. Rachel ordered fiber testing on the wrist areas. Microscopic threads were recovered. Synthetic, dark in color. Preliminary weave pattern consistent with industrial zip restraints. Leonard Keene's garage contained a drawer with similar restraints. Unopened package count did not match manufacturing standard. One missing. Still circumstantial. Still building. But building toward one direction. Late evening approached. Rachel listened again to the breathing. It began steady. Then, near the end of the deleted recording, there was a subtle change. A slight lag between inhale and exhale. A faint tightening. Not panic. Physiological response. Then the footsteps. Then silence. The emergency call followed minutes later, which means Thomas regained just enough clarity to speak, just enough awareness to choose a word. Not help. Not please. Not a name. Basement. If he intended that word for police, he could have said more. Unless he knew time was limited. Unless he understood he had miscalculated. Rachel leaned forward over her desk. The theory of consensual ritual no longer held cleanly. Consent does not require concealment. Consent does not require device removal. Consent does not require sedative escalation. Leonard Keene had offered structure. Thomas Hale had sought control. But somewhere between symbolic boundary and chemical enforcement, the line shifted. The chalk circle was not protection. It was target acquisition. And the whisper may not have been confirmation. It may have been warning. One word. One location. Left deliberately incomplete. Because Thomas Hale may have realized, in the final seconds, that surrender is easy. But reclaiming control is not. Control, once surrendered, rarely returns in the same form. By the fourth day of the investigation, Detective Rachel Monroe stopped asking whether Thomas Hale consented to the ritual. She began asking when consent ended. Forensic fiber analysis confirmed the synthetic threads recovered from Thomas's wrists matched industrial zip restraints manufactured in bulk packs of 50. The partial pack recovered from Leonard Keene's garage contained 48 units. 2 missing. Keene claimed he used them for cable management in recent home repairs. Rachel requested verification. No cables in his garage displayed fresh securing marks. No clipped ends were located in trash receptacles. Small details accumulate weight. Meanwhile, toxicology deepened its findings. The first sedative compound present in Thomas's bloodstream matched a commercially available anti-anxiety medication. The second compound, the one responsible for respiratory suppression, was not prescription grade. It was compounded, custom blended. Trace binding agents indicated laboratory mixing rather than pharmaceutical production. Rachel expanded the warrant to include Keene's online purchasing history. 2 months prior, he had ordered precursor chemicals through separate vendors, each purchase small enough to avoid automatic regulatory flags. Individually harmless, collectively useful. Intent often hides in distribution patterns. Rachel confronted Keene with the chemical procurement data. He did not deny the purchases. He reframed them. He claimed intellectual curiosity, claimed experimentation for personal knowledge, claimed no intent to harm. She asked him directly, did Thomas know the dosage would escalate? Keene paused. That pause mattered more than his answer. He stated Thomas trusted him. Trust introduces vulnerability. Vulnerability introduces leverage. Digital forensics reconstructed additional fragments from Keene's phone backup stored in a cloud archive he believed deleted. One complete message thread surfaced. Thomas, will I be able to stop it if I panic? Keene, you won't panic. That's the point. Thomas, but if I do? Keene, stay inside the boundary. I'll handle the rest. Stay inside the boundary. Rachel studied that phrase carefully. If Thomas believed Keene retained control over the outcome, then the circle was not self-imposed structure. It was delegated authority. The wrist impressions suggested Thomas may have attempted to move. Perhaps not immediately. Perhaps only when physiological response intensified. Zip restraints could be applied quickly, removed quickly, leaving faint compression but minimal abrasion. Which explains the shallow marking. Rachel revisited the audio once more, isolating the moment before the emergency call. There was something new. A soft exhale not matching Thomas's breathing pattern. Not in the deleted recording. In the 911 call itself. After the whisper, a second breath, subtle, but present. Someone remained in the basement when the call was placed. Which meant the whisper was not private. It was delivered in the presence of the other person. Rachel requested call metadata beyond audio. The call duration, 12 seconds. Connection quality strong. No ambient interference, which means proximity to router remained unchanged. Thomas had enough oxygenation to dial, connect, and articulate one word. Which raises a critical question. If Keene intended to conceal everything, why allow the call at all? Unless he did not realize it happened. Or he allowed it deliberately. Rachel returned to the Hale residence at dusk. She stood again in the basement. Dim light. Concrete cold beneath her boots. She recreated positioning based on audio mapping. If Thomas sat centered and Keene approached from behind, then applied restraints briefly during dispersal, he could release them once sedation deepened. He could then remove the aerosol device from the vent. He could stand near enough to hear the emergency call without fully comprehending it. Because a whisper can be mistaken for breath. Unless one listens carefully, Rachel closed her eyes and imagined the sequence. Thomas sits, breathing steady. Aerosol dispersal engages with a metallic click. Air thickens subtly. Sedative enters bloodstream through lungs. Initial calm. Gradual heaviness. Perhaps mild disorientation. He attempts to rise. Zip restraint secures wrists momentarily. He remains beneath the vent. Compound concentration peaks. Respiratory suppression begins. Keene releases restraints. Removes device. Watches. Waits. Thomas regains flicker of awareness. Reaches for phone. Whispers location. Disconnects. The circle remains undisturbed. Because no one crosses it once sedation ends. Rachel opened her eyes. There was one flaw. Why leave the chalk circle at all? If concealment was priority, why not erase the symbol? Unless the circle itself was meant to redirect investigators toward ritual theory, toward consent, toward psychological experiment gone wrong, away from chemical homicide, which suggests premeditation layered with misdirection. Rachel ordered a behavioral profile assessment. Preliminary profile indicated Keene exhibited high cognitive structuring tendencies, preference for controlled environments, intellectual superiority framing, history of offering solutions to others' anxieties. Thomas Hale fit a complementary pattern. Methodical, control-driven, uncomfortable with unpredictability, seeking mastery over fear. The partnership dynamic becomes clear in such pairings. One seeks certainty, the other offers it, until the offer evolves into dominance. Rachel scheduled a second formal interrogation. This time, she began with silence. Keene filled it predictably. He spoke about philosophy, about boundaries, about transcendence through surrender. She let him continue until he contradicted himself. He stated at one point that Thomas never panicked during prior sessions. Prior sessions, which implies repetition, which implies dosage familiarity. Rachel asked how many times he had administered inhaled compounds. Keene corrected himself quickly, said none. But the correction came too fast, too rehearsed. Lab analysis of Thomas's hair samples revealed trace buildup of the first sedative compound over several weeks. Repeated exposure, low dose, building trust, building tolerance, building dependency on ritual. Rachel shifted the approach. Did you ever consider that he might trust you more than he trusted himself? Keene's jaw tightened. Trust is currency. When someone else holds it, power shifts. Rachel presented the final piece gathered that evening. Traffic camera footage from a street 2 blocks away captured Keene's vehicle leaving his driveway at 12:20 a.m. on the night of Thomas's death. Returning at 12:43, he claimed he never left home. The timeline aligned with device removal window. The gap was not large, but it was enough. Enough to circle the block. Enough to re-enter quietly. Enough to ensure no mechanism remained. Keene's composure fractured slightly for the first time. Not fear. Irritation. He believed he had constructed something precise, something untraceable. He underestimated accumulation. Rachel concluded the interrogation without accusation. Because the final question was not whether he caused death. It was whether Thomas realized it before the end. The whisper still mattered. If Thomas recognized escalation, recognized betrayal, then basement was not random. It was indictment, a single coordinate, left intentionally, for investigators to decode. Because sometimes, in the final seconds of controlled surrender, clarity returns, and the only thing left to reclaim is truth. By the fifth day, the case no longer revolved around uncertainty. It revolved around timing. Detective Rachel Monroe did not need a confession. She needed sequence integrity, proof that escalation occurred without Thomas Hale's informed consent. Because consent, once invalidated, converts experiment into homicide. Forensic toxicology delivered a refined metabolic timeline. The first sedative compound, administered repeatedly over prior weeks, created mild dependency and psychological conditioning. Thomas's system had adapted to low doses. The second compound, the compounded respiratory suppressant, had never appeared in prior samples. This was its first introduction, and its concentration was not experimental. It was lethal, which meant one of two things. Either Leonard Keene miscalculated catastrophically, or he intended the dosage to be terminal. Rachel focused on preparation behavior. 2 days before the death, Thomas Hale searched online for phrases including oxygen saturation monitoring, how long until unconsciousness from inhaled sedative, and safe exposure threshold aerosol. He was researching safety. He was attempting to quantify risk. That suggests he did not expect death. He expected parameters. Keene's search history during the same period told a different story. Respiratory suppression onset curve. Time to irreversible hypoxia. Ventilation concentration lethal range. Not anxiety reduction. Not meditation. Outcomes. Measured outcomes. Rachel requested chemical dispersion modeling from forensic analysts. Using the basement dimensions and HVAC airflow rates, they simulated aerosol release from a 2-inch device affixed inside the vent. At maximum output, lethal concentration would accumulate directly beneath the vent within 3 to 5 minutes. Peripheral areas of the basement would experience significantly lower exposure, which explained why no heavy residue was found beyond the central zone. Thomas Hale was positioned exactly where exposure would peak. That positioning required planning and knowledge. Rachel revisited the chalk circle measurements, 6 feet and 2 inches in diameter. The optimal lethal exposure radius from the vent measured approximately 3 feet in all directions from center, which meant the circle was twice the necessary diameter, symbolic outer boundary, but lethal center smaller. Thomas may have believed the entire circle was safe. In reality, only its edges offered marginal reduction in concentration. But he was seated precisely in the middle, which means someone instructed him to remain centered. Rachel reconstructed conversation patterns from recovered messages. Thomas frequently asked, "Am I doing it correctly?" Keene's responses emphasized precision, exact center. Symmetry matters. Trust the process. Symmetry did not matter for meditation. It mattered for targeting. The emergency call replayed in Rachel's office once more. She slowed the audio to half speed. The breathing pattern shifted sharply between the deleted recording and the live call. In the deleted file, breathing remained slow and controlled. In the call, the inhalation preceding the word, basement, carried subtle strain, micro-gasp, early hypoxic reflex, which indicates Thomas recognized something was wrong, not abstractly, physiologically. He understood the exposure exceeded expectation. Rachel asked a forensic linguist to analyze the whisper itself. Why choose a noun instead of a plea? The linguist suggested location references during acute cognitive narrowing often reflect urgent anchoring. When speech capacity diminishes, subjects prioritize the most actionable information. Location is actionable, emotion is not. Thomas may have had seconds of clarity. He chose coordinates, not emotion, which contradicts Keene's claim that Thomas viewed the event as controlled surrender. If it were controlled, he would not need to alert authorities. Rachel prepared a warrant for full chemical trace analysis inside Keene's vehicle. The trunk lining revealed minute particulate consistent with the second compound's binding agent, embedded in carpet fibers, vacuumed but not erased. Trace analysis rarely lies. Rachel returned to Leonard Keene for the third interrogation. This time, she laid out the airflow model, the metabolic data, the trace particulate, the the search history. And then she did something deliberate. She placed a printed still frame from traffic camera footage on the table. Keen's vehicle at 12:20 a.m., headlights visible. Leaving, he stared at it longer than necessary. Silence again. But this time, silence carried weight. You went back, Rachel said evenly. No, he replied. You removed the device. No. You escalated the dosage beyond what he expected. Keen's jaw flexed. He wanted to confront death, he said. Rachel did not correct him. She asked one question instead. Did he want to die? The pause lasted 6 seconds. Too long. He trusted me. Keen said quietly, trust again. Trust without transparency is manipulation. Rachel leaned forward slightly. You controlled the concentration, she said. You controlled the timing. You controlled the outcome. Keen's breathing changed. A subtle acceleration. For the first time, he was not calm. He said he wasn't afraid. Keen replied. That doesn't mean he agreed to stop breathing. The statement lingered. Rachel watched micro-expressions fracture composure further. Then Keen made a mistake. He stayed inside the boundary, he said. Rachel's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. How do you know he stayed inside? Keen realized it too late. No one had publicly confirmed Thomas never crossed the chalk line. That detail remained internal to investigators, which means Keen had knowledge only present at the scene, knowledge consistent with direct observation. The room fell silent. Evidence rarely announces itself. It reveals through inconsistency. Rachel closed the file folder deliberately. You believed the circle meant control, she said. It did. Keen insisted. No. Rachel replied. It meant he trusted you to stop. Outside the interrogation room, prosecutors reviewed the cumulative evidence. Premeditation does not require dramatic violence. It requires planning, chemical acquisition, positioning, device installation, removal, misdirection. All present. Rachel returned once more to the basement that evening. Not for evidence, for understanding. She stood at the center of the faded chalk outline. The edges were now smudged from investigative traffic, but the center remained visible. She looked up at the vent. Imagine the invisible descent of aerosolized compound. Imagine Thomas waiting, trusting, believing the person standing nearby would intervene before irreversible harm. The whisper replayed in her mind. Basement. It was not fear. It was clarity. In his final seconds, Thomas Hale did not beg. He did not accuse. He provided the one piece of information that could dismantle illusion. Because if investigators looked at the basement carefully, they would see the difference between ritual and execution. And sometimes the smallest word carries the heaviest indictment. Arrest warrants are paperwork. Understanding motive is reconstruction. By the 6th day, Leonard Keen sat in county holding, formally charged with premeditated homicide. The language in the affidavit was precise. Chemical administration, intentional concealment, structured misdirection. But Detective Rachel Monroe remained focused on the psychological architecture behind it. Because method explains how, architecture explains why. Digital forensic recovery continued combing through Thomas Hale's archived emails, cloud notes, and browser history. A private document surfaced, untitled, unsent, created 3 weeks before his death. It read like a journal entry. I feel like my fear controls everything. If I can sit inside it long enough without reacting, maybe I'll finally be free. Rachel read it twice. Thomas was not suicidal. He was exhausted. Exhaustion seeks certainty. Certainty often presents itself in the voice of someone confident. Leonard Keen had cultivated that voice. Additional messages revealed the gradual escalation of trust. Week 1 breathing exercises. Week 2 mild sedatives to deepen focus. Week 3 timed exposure sessions in the basement. Thomas described early sessions as peaceful. He wrote that sitting in the imagined boundary reduced panic spikes. There was no mention of aerosol devices. No mention of respiratory suppression. Only the idea of surrendering anxiety within a safe perimeter. Rachel reconstructed what likely occurred across those weeks. Keen introduced minor chemical exposure in small, controlled doses, low enough to avoid alarm. Thomas associated the physical heaviness with therapeutic progress. Each session reinforced dependency, not on the compound, but on Keen's oversight. Keen became the regulator, The monitor. The authority. By the final session, Thomas likely believed escalation remained within agreed limits. He likely believed Keene would intervene at threshold. The airflow model showed that lethal concentration was reached within minutes, but sub-lethal concentration begins earlier. Rachel consulted a pulmonary specialist regarding hypoxic onset perception. The specialist explained that early-stage oxygen deprivation can create confusion, delayed alarm response, and misplaced calm, which means Thomas may not have recognized the danger immediately. When he did, it was already advanced. Rachel revisited the audio yet again, this time mapping timeline against modeled concentration curve. Deleted recording begins at 11:58. Aerosol likely activated seconds later. By 12:01, concentration would reach sedative intensification. By 12:02, respiratory suppression begins. At 12:03, emergency call placed, which places the whisper at the edge of viable consciousness. He regained just enough clarity to identify environment. That suggests the second compound's onset was not instantaneous, which suggests Keene remained present long enough to observe reaction. Rachel reviewed interrogation footage once more. In one segment, Keene said quietly, almost defensively, he said he wanted to see how far he could go. Rachel paused the video. The phrase mattered, how far he could go, not how far we would go. Thomas framed the experience as exploration. Keene reframed it as endurance. Exploration ends when participant chooses. Endurance ends when observer allows. Rachel requested analysis of the chalk itself. Residue layering showed two distinct application events. An older, faint chalk outline beneath the visible one, meaning the circle had been drawn before, erased partially, redrawn thicker the night of death. Earlier sessions may have been rehearsal, positioning practice, trust reinforcement. The final circle was not spontaneous. It was culmination. Rachel met briefly with Marianne Hale to inform her of formal charges. Marianne listened without interruption. When Rachel described the airflow model, Marianne closed her eyes. He believed he was fixing himself, she said quietly. Rachel did not respond with reassurance. There is no reassurance appropriate in such moments. Instead, she asked one final clarifying question. Did Thomas ever mention stopping the sessions? Marianne nodded faintly. Last week, she said. He told me he thought he was ready to manage anxiety alone. Rachel felt the detail settle heavily. If Thomas intended to stop, then Keene's control was ending. And control, once threatened, often escalates. Digital timestamps revealed that 2 days before the fatal session, Thomas had not responded to Keene's message for several hours. Keene followed up with, "You can't quit mid-process." Language of ownership. Language of dependency. Rachel returned to the holding facility for one final conversation. Not interrogation. Clarification. Keene sat rigid but composed. Rachel placed the journal entry printout on the table. He was trying to reduce fear, she said. Keene stared at the page. He was weak, he replied. The statement revealed more than any confession. Not weak in body, weak in autonomy. In Keene's worldview, reliance justified intervention. Rachel leaned forward slightly. You escalated because he was leaving, she said. Keene did not answer, but silence confirmed more than denial. Control dynamics rarely tolerate abandonment. If Thomas planned to stop the sessions, then Keene risked losing authority. The final session became demonstration. Not therapy, not experiment. Demonstration of ultimate control. The chalk circle was stagecraft. The aerosol device was execution. The whisper disrupted the narrative, because Thomas did not say, "I trust you." He said, "Basement." He anchored investigators to the scene. He ensured the illusion of consent would not survive forensic scrutiny. As Rachel left the facility, evening light dimmed across the parking lot. The case file was nearly complete. Chemical procurement, device residue, fiber matches, traffic footage, digital messages, metabolic modeling, all converging. But what lingered was not the chemistry. It was the simplicity of the final act, one word. Delivered at the precise intersection between awareness and collapse. A word that shifted the story from ritual to homicide. Because sometimes reclaiming control is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is not even fully articulate. Sometimes it is only a location, left behind deliberately, so that someone else can finish what you no longer have time to say. The prosecution's strategy crystallized around one concept: illusion of consent. Without visible trauma, without forced entry, without overt violence, the defense would argue participation. They would argue autonomy. They would argue that Thomas Hale walked into the basement willingly. Detective Rachel Monroe understood that cases like this do not hinge on whether a man sat in a chair. They hinge on whether he understood the true risk. Expert testimony preparation began on the seventh day. A forensic toxicologist outlined the difference between therapeutic sedative exposure and compounded respiratory suppression. The lethal compound introduced that night was not an accidental miscalculation within a known tolerance range. It was outside it entirely. A behavioral psychologist prepared to explain coercive authority dynamics, how gradual conditioning builds trust, how controlled escalation distorts perception of risk, and how authority figures can redefine danger as growth. Rachel assembled the timeline board one final time. Week 1, Introduction of Structured Boundaries. Week 2, Mild Pharmacological Reinforcement. Week 3, Normalization of Inhalation Exposure. Final night, Escalation beyond precedent. Every step incremental. Every escalation small enough to avoid alarm. Until the last one was not. The defense attempted early narrative framing in preliminary hearings. They suggested Thomas was fascinated with mortality exposure exercises. They suggested he researched oxygen deprivation willingly. Rachel anticipated that angle. She requested full context extraction of Thomas's search queries. Yes, he searched oxygen thresholds, but paired with phrases like safe range, monitoring device, and stop signal. He was not searching for lethal limits. He was searching for safety mechanisms, which he believed existed. Phone location metadata placed Keen's device within 5 feet of Thomas's phone at the time of the emergency call. Defense argued proximity did not prove awareness. Rachel disagreed. She replayed the enhanced audio inside the courtroom demonstration. Breathing, whisper, then the faint second breath. The prosecutor paused the clip at that exact moment. Silence filled the chamber. 2 people in that basement. One dying, one listening. Rachel testified to the chalk layering analysis. 2 circles. Earlier session and final session. Practice and culmination. She explained the airflow model carefully, step by step. The lethal concentration zone measured smaller than the chalk boundary, which means the boundary was symbolic, not protective. The chair was positioned in the most concentrated exposure point. Precision does not happen accidentally. When asked whether Thomas could have survived had he moved away from center, the forensic expert stated yes. Peripheral oxygen concentration remained survivable during early minutes, which means position mattered, and position was instructed. The defense attempted to reframe the zip restraint fiber evidence as unrelated garage materials. Rachel responded by introducing manufacturing batch analysis. The partial pack found in Keen's garage came from a production lot with microscopic dye variation. The fibers recovered from Thomas's wrists matched the dye variation. Probability of random match was statistically negligible. Gradual conditioning, escalation, physical securing, device installation, removal, emergency call. Each element alone could be questioned. Together, they formed structure. Leonard Keen maintained composure through much of the proceedings. But during expert testimony regarding hypoxic cognitive narrowing, something shifted. The specialist explained that in final seconds, victims often prioritize essential information. Location, cause, identity. Rachel watched Keen as the audio clip played once more. Basement. The word echoed through the courtroom. It sounded smaller in that space, but heavier, because it contradicted the defense narrative. A man willingly confronting mortality does not call emergency services at the threshold. A man realizing deception does. Cross-examination attempted to suggest Thomas's whisper might have been part of the ritual itself. Rachel countered with call metadata. If ritual included emergency services, there would be prior similar calls. There were none. No rehearsals. No precedent. The whisper was anomaly. Anomalies signal deviation. Deviation signals rupture of expectation. The prosecution then presented traffic footage timeline. Vehicle leaving at 12:20, returning at 12:43. Defense argued coincidence. Rachel introduced particulate analysis from Keen's trunk carpet. Compound binder residue. Rare formulation. matched to the lethal compound mixture. Coincidence narrowed further. By the end of the 7th day of proceedings, the illusion of consent had weakened significantly, but Rachel's focus remained on something else. Intent. Not just to administer chemical, but to escalate when control slipped. In a recess conversation recorded inadvertently when microphones remained active, Keene muttered under his breath, "He wouldn't have stopped." The phrase was subtle, but it revealed perspective. In his mind, Thomas did not have the right to disengage. Authority had transferred. Rachel documented the statement immediately, because sometimes motive hides in frustration, not confession. As the day concluded, Rachel returned once more to her office. The basement photo lay on her desk. Chair centered. Chalk boundary visible. Overhead vent above. She considered how easily the scene could have missiled investigators. Without the whisper. Without that single coordinate. The circle could have suggested ritual suicide, experimental miscalculation, shared responsibility. But the whisper narrowed focus. It pointed not to philosophy, not to symbolism, but to location, to physical evidence, to airflow modeling, to particulate residue. It redirected interpretation from abstract intent to mechanical execution. Thomas Hale did not leave a manifesto. He left geometry. And one word. Sometimes justice does not hinge on dramatic revelation. It hinges on careful listening. Because in cases where control masquerades as guidance, the smallest deviation exposes the truth. And in the basement of a quiet suburban home, truth waited exactly where he said it would. Verdicts are delivered in minutes. Understanding takes longer. By the 8th phase of proceedings, the structure of the case no longer relied on speculation. It relied on contrast. Contrast between what Thomas Hale believed was happening and what Leonard Keene engineered. The prosecution's closing argument avoided emotional emphasis. Instead, it reconstructed sequence, not philosophy, not personality. Sequence. Thomas sought anxiety reduction. Keene offered controlled exposure. Initial sessions reinforced trust. Low-dose compounds introduced compliance without alarm. The chalk circle began as imagination, then rehearsal, then installation of physical boundary. The final session introduced escalation, unannounced, unmonitored, lethal. Rachel watched the jury as the airflow simulation played once more on screen. A digital rendering of the basement appeared, air particles visualized in gradient layers, red concentration directly beneath the vent, fading to yellow at perimeter. Minimal exposure near staircase. The model did not accuse. It demonstrated. The chair's position aligned precisely with the highest concentration. The prosecutor asked the expert one final question. If Thomas Hale had moved 3 feet in any direction during the first minute, would he likely have survived? Yes. The expert replied. Movement equals survival. Stillness equals concentration. Which means remaining centered was fatal. Remaining centered required instruction. The defense attempted a final pivot. They suggested Thomas's personality favored precision, that he would have positioned himself symmetrically regardless of instruction. Rachel anticipated this. She introduced prior session photographs recovered from Thomas's phone. In earlier images, faint smudges indicated looser boundaries. The chair was slightly offset, not perfectly centered, which meant precision increased over time. Guidance intensified. The final circle was thicker, darker, more deliberate. Escalation again. Then came the audio. Played in full. Breathing. Click. Footsteps. Silence. Call. Basement. Rachel did not look at the jury during playback. She looked at Keene. His expression remained composed until the moment the forensic linguist testified again. In acute hypoxic states, subjects often prioritize actionable information in single-word utterances. Actionable information location. That word reframed the whisper from passive to intentional. It reframed Thomas from participant to informant, because he understood, in that narrowing tunnel of consciousness, that something was wrong, and he chose evidence over ego. The jury deliberated less than 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom atmosphere remained restrained. No dramatic reactions. No visible collapse. Just clarity. Guilty on all counts. Premeditated homicide. Chemical administration with intent. Evidence concealment. Leonard Keene did not look at Thomas's family when the verdict was read. He stared forward. Still. As though centered within an invisible boundary of his own. Rachel felt no triumph. Cases built on control rarely produce catharsis. They produce recognition. Recognition that harm does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it presents as mentorship, as guidance, as structured self-improvement. The difference lies in transparency. After sentencing, Rachel visited the Hale residence one final time before it was cleared for sale. The basement had been cleaned, the chalk removed, the chair gone. But faint discoloration remained on the concrete where the circle once existed. Residual trace of boundary. She stood at the approximate center again. Looked upward. Imagined the vent. Imagined invisible descent. Imagined Thomas realizing too late that trust had shifted into dependence. She considered the phrase Keene repeated. Stay inside the boundary. Boundaries protect only when mutual. When one person defines them unilaterally, they become containment. Thomas believed the circle would contain fear. It contained him. But in the final seconds, he broke containment. Not physically, verbally. One word breached illusion. Rachel left the basement and ascended the stairs slowly. Upstairs, daylight filtered through familiar kitchen windows. Life above. Containment below. The contrast remained stark. In her report summary, she wrote a single concluding line. The victim's final utterance directed investigative focus to the mechanism of harm. No flourish. No dramatics. Because the power of the case did not lie in spectacle. It lay in correction. Correction of a narrative that could have framed death as voluntary transcendence. Correction of an illusion of consent built meticulously over weeks. And correction delivered by the person whose voice nearly disappeared. Outside, evening settled quietly across Linden Grove. Neighbors resumed routine. Grass would be cut again. Mail would be stacked again. But one house would carry invisible history. A reminder that control offered without accountability is not guidance. It is ownership. And ownership, when challenged, escalates. Thomas Hale did not regain physical control, but he reclaimed narrative control in the only way left available to him. He named the place. And in naming it, he ensured the truth would not remain contained. Sentencing concluded the legal process. It did not conclude the analysis. For Detective Rachel Monroe, closure is administrative. Understanding is ongoing. Leonard Keene received a life sentence without eligibility for early release. The court cited premeditation, chemical concealment, and manipulation of trust as aggravating factors. The language of the ruling avoided philosophical framing. It focused on mechanics, acquisition, installation, administration, removal. But Rachel continued to examine the case file for structural lessons. Because cases involving psychological coercion rarely end with a single offender. They reveal patterns applicable elsewhere. She reviewed the initial responding officer's body camera footage from the morning of discovery. The basement scene, untouched. The chalk circle stark against concrete. Thomas seated upright. Hands resting naturally. The absence of visible struggle nearly convincing. Without chemical analysis, without airflow modeling, without digital reconstruction, the scene could have been misclassified. Accidental overdose during experimental therapy. Self-directed harm. Mutual risk-taking gone wrong. The illusion was carefully engineered. Rachel compiled a supplementary memorandum for departmental training. Subject indicators of coercive structured harm. She outlined key markers: incremental escalation disguised as improvement. Authority consolidation through expertise framing. Safety language paired with hidden risk amplification. Symbolic boundaries masking operational targeting. Emergency utterances as deviation signals. The last point carried particular emphasis. Deviation signals. The whisper did not fit the narrative Keene constructed. That deviation forced deeper inquiry. Without it, investigators might have focused narrowly on consent. Instead, they focused on mechanism. Rachel consulted with a forensic psychologist after trial regarding coercive surrender dynamics. The psychologist explained that individuals seeking relief from anxiety often gravitate toward rigid systems promising control. Those systems can be therapeutic when transparent. They become exploitative when information is asymmetrical. Thomas possessed partial knowledge. Keene possessed full knowledge. That imbalance defined the crime. Rachel revisited the original deleted audio one final time before archiving. Breathing steady, metallic click, footsteps, silence. There was no audible malice, no raised voice, no overt threat. Control can be quiet. and quiet harm is often misread as calm. The file included a final technical analysis from the lab. Trace sediment from the basement HVH filter indicated sustained aerosol output for approximately 2 minutes before tapering. Not a brief release, not accidental discharge. Sustained, which means Keene allowed the concentration to build, allowed suppression to progress, watched, monitoring without intervening. Rachel added one final note to the case archive. Intent inferred from sustained exposure duration exceeding agreed therapeutic parameters. Clinical phrasing. Clear, objective. Yet beneath that phrasing lay a simpler truth. Thomas Hale trusted someone to stop before irreversible harm. That stop never came. Instead, Thomas initiated the only interruption available to him. A call, a whisper, a coordinate. The Hale residence eventually sold 6 months later. The basement was renovated, new flooring installed, vent replaced, concrete sealed, physical traces erased. But case files do not renovate. They remain intact. Rachel often reflects on how differently the case might have unfolded had Thomas said nothing. Had he lost consciousness without speech? The chalk circle alone would have suggested ritual. The sedatives alone could have implied miscalculation. The removal of the device might have succeeded in obscuring mechanism. But one word created a pivot point. A pivot from theory to evidence. From assumption to measurement. From consent to coercion. In training sessions, Rachel now plays only the final 3 seconds of the call. Breath, whisper, disconnect. She asks trainees a single question. What does he want you to look at? The answer is always the same. Location. And location leads to mechanism. Mechanism leads to intent. Intent leads to accountability. As night settles over the city beyond her office window, Rachel closes the case file. Not because the story ends, but because the lesson stabilizes. Control offered without transparency is not guidance. Boundaries defined by one person alone are not protection. And surrender is safe only when the person holding power is accountable. Thomas Hale sought freedom from fear. Instead, he encountered someone who mistook control for care. In his final seconds, clarity returned. He named the room. He anchored the truth. And in doing so, he prevented his death from being misclassified as participation. Sometimes justice is not loud. It is not immediate. It does not arrive with dramatic revelation. Sometimes justice begins with a whisper, and investigators willing to hear it. There are cases that end in noise, and there are cases that end in calibration. For Detective Rachel Monroe, the Hale investigation did not conclude with the verdict. It concluded with refinement, of perception, of protocol, of instinct. The basement on Linden Grove was empty now, renovated, neutral, stripped of the geometry that once defined it. But the lesson remained architectural. The illusion of consent had nearly succeeded. If Thomas Hale had not placed that call, if he had not forced oxygen through failing lungs to articulate a single coordinate, the case may have settled into ambiguity. Instead, it became precision. Rachel finalized her internal review report with an emphasis on 3 pillars. First, incremental conditioning must be treated as potential coercion when authority imbalance is present. Second, symbolic staging often disguises mechanical targeting. Third, final utterances, no matter how brief, must be treated as investigative direction, not emotional noise. The department implemented updated response protocols for suspected, consensual experimental harm cases. Scene interpretation would no longer rely solely on visible struggle. Chemical and environmental modeling would be standard in ambiguous deaths involving structured setups. Quiet harm requires louder scrutiny. Rachel met briefly with the forensic linguist one last time before archiving the audio file permanently. They revisited the cadence of the whisper. Not rushed. Not broken, but compressed. As if the body understood time was narrowing. Location words during hypoxia often carry urgency without volume. The body prioritizes survival data transmission. Thomas did not waste air on explanation. He provided coordinates. Rachel considered how easily that could have been misread as ritual cue, some symbolic final word within a philosophical exercise. But ritual language is repetitive, predictable, documented in prior sessions. There was no history of emergency calls in earlier practices, no precedent for involving outside observers. The whisper was deviation. Deviation is disruption. Disruption breaks illusion. Leonard Keene's psychological profile was finalized after conviction. Dominant traits included cognitive superiority bias, structured environmental preference, and tolerance for gradual escalation when control is threatened. The psychologist noted something precise. Subject exhibits strong need to maintain role as regulator of others' emotional states. Regulator, not partner, not guide. Regulator implies authority without mutuality. Thomas Hale believed he was confronting fear. In reality, he transferred regulatory power over his own physiological safety to someone else. That transfer, unbalanced, proved fatal. Rachel revisited the airflow model once more before digital archiving. 3-dimensional visualization of concentration fields. Red at center. Orange fading outward. Yellow at edges. If Thomas had stood, if he had moved even one pace toward the staircase during early exposure, survival probability increased dramatically. But he stayed centered, because he believed the boundary was protective. Trust kept him still. Trust, manipulated, kept him exposed. The zip restraint fibers remained one of the quietest yet most definitive elements. Temporary securing. Just long enough. Released before permanent marking. Subtle force. Minimal trace. Designed to preserve appearance of willingness. Rachel closed the case summary with factual restraint. Victim's final communication materially redirected investigative focus to environmental mechanism inconsistent with informed consent. It was not poetic, it was accurate. Months later, during a training seminar, Rachel projected an image of a blank concrete floor on screen. No circle, no chair, no vent. She asked the room, "What do you assume when you see no visible violence?" The answers varied: calm, voluntary, accidental. She then played the final audio clip. Breath, basement, silence. She paused. What changes now? Understanding shifted, because the absence of visible violence does not equal absence of force. Force can be chemical, psychological, environmental, and sometimes the only counterforce available to a victim is information. Thomas Hale did not escape. He did not overpower. He did not physically disrupt the structure built around him, but he transmitted location. He ensured investigators would examine environment, not philosophy. He prevented misclassification. That is not dramatic resistance. It is strategic resistance. As Rachel leaves the seminar room, evening light filters through hallway windows. The city hums beyond glass. Ordinary routines continue. Somewhere, someone is seeking control over fear. Somewhere else, someone is offering certainty in exchange for authority. The difference between guidance and ownership often appears subtle, until it is not. In a quiet basement, beneath a vent no one initially questioned, a man realized too late that the boundary he trusted had become containment, and with his final breath he dismantled it. One word: precise, unadorned, enough. Case closed. If this case stayed with you, subscribe for more investigations where every detail counts. And in the comments, tell me, what was the moment you knew something didn't add up?